Yeah. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi. So welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. My name is Michael Camilleri. I direct the Dialogue's Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program. We are delighted today to welcome you all and to partner with Counterpart International for a discussion on criminal violence and transitional justice in El Salvador. In recent weeks, this country, has been consumed by images of undocumented immigrants being separated from their children under the administration's policy of prosecuting and detaining those who cross the border illegally. Most of these immigrants hail from the northern triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And the border crisis has provoked a renewed discussion of the root causes driving migrants to flee their home countries and make the dangerous journey to the United States. So today we're going to take a deep dive into one of those countries, El Salvador. El Salvador has made important strides in the quarter century since a 12-year civil war that left 75,000 people dead. It has a stable democracy with regular elections, and notably, it has elected governments of both the right and the left, including the current president, Salvador Sánchez Serén, a former guerrilla leader during the Civil War. But despite the transition to peace and democracy, El Salvador remains an extremely violent place. It has one of the highest homicide rates in the world, Central America's highest number of gang members, and 42% of small businesses suffer extortion. Successive governments have tried to attack the crime and violence problem, often with a mano dura, iron fist approach, to little avail. El Salvador's overcrowded prisons are teeming with youth gang members, but jails often operate as incubators of crime rather than rehabilitation centers. The police, struggling to contain the crime epidemic, have faced credible accusations of corruption and extrajudicial executions. Impunity for both violent crime and human rights violations is high, despite some notable exceptions, such as a conviction last week of 4 police officers for aggravated homicide. Alongside these contemporary challenges, El Salvador continues to wrestle with the legacy of its past. In 2016, the Supreme Court of the country struck down the 1993 Amnesty Law, enacted at the conclusion of the devastating Civil War, clearing the way for the first time for prosecutors to reopen cases and victims to seek justice. Some have argued that these efforts distract attention and resources from present-day challenges facing the country. Others argue that impunity for past atrocities is to blame for the weak rule of law that has emerged in the post-conflict period. Today, we're very fortunate to benefit from 3 expert perspectives on the challenges facing El Salvador and the broader question of how past and present efforts to strengthen the rule of law relate to one another. To my left, good friend, Milady Guilarte, is currently country representative for Counterpart International in El Salvador, where she leads a project on strengthening human rights. Milady joined Counterpart in 2017 after a decade in Washington, working for various humanitarian, development, and diplomatic institutions at the World Bank, the United Nations, and most recently at the National Security Council and USAID during the Obama administration. Leonor Arteaga is a Salvadoran attorney who joined the Due Process of Law Foundation in January 2012 and heads its program on impunity and grave human rights violations. She leads investigations, advocacy, and monitoring and analysis on issues relating to memory, truth, justice, and guarantees for non-recurrence of past armed conflicts and current situations of state violence in Latin America. In addition, in February 2018, Leonor was appointed by the Salvadoran government as a commissioner for the National Commission for the Search for Disappeared Persons, con la búsqueda. Chuck Call is an associate professor of international peace and conflict resolution at American University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He focuses on post-war peace building, state building, democratization, human rights, and police and justice reform. And he has conducted field research in Central America, West Africa, the Balkans, Colombia, Haiti, and Afghanistan. From 2012 to 2014, he served as a senior advisor in the State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization operations, where he helped to keep me in line. Chuck lived in a settlement for displaced persons in El Salvador for 15 months during the Civil War from 1987 to 1988. And he's published on El Salvador's transition from war to peace and on the creation of its police force. So we're really delighted again to welcome Milady, Leonor, and Chuck. I'm sure this will be a terrific conversation with three leading experts. We're going to jump right into the conversation. We'll do that for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time to take questions from what I'm sure is a very well-informed audience. So with that, maybe Leonor, as our Salvadoran representative on the panel, maybe I'll start with you. You're obviously from El Salvador, but now based in Washington. And I'm just curious, as you kind of listen to the debate that we're having at the moment, again, about the root causes of migration from Central America, what comes to your mind? What is this city getting right about what's happening in your country, and what are we missing in terms of the conditions that are driving migrants from El Salvador to make the journey to the United States?
Well, thanks, Michael, and thanks to the Inter-American Dialogue and Counterpart International for organizing this really interesting conversation. Well, when thinking about the causes of migration from Central America, what comes to my mind is that we're looking at a potential humanitarian crisis rather than a security emergency. So the United States needs to adopt a humanitarian approach or responses to these needs of those who are fleeing for their lives and seeking protection here at the U.S. Salvadorian people, as probably most of you know, take all kinds of risks to come to this country, and that's for a reason. When we think of El Salvador, it's well known that that country is experiencing day crime as comparable to wartime violence, which is causing a new wave of internal and external or international displacement. This violence comes from different sources, but it's largely due to the maras, right? These local street gangs groups. In many middle-class neighborhoods and in most poor communities, gangs impose their own rules. Children and young men are often threatened or pressured to join gangs, while young women often experience different kind of sexual assaults. Extortion is widespread. Small businesses, the public transportation industry, and in general, poor people are the most heavily hit by this kind of violence. Family and domestic violence is also a factor in the decision to migrate for many women and children. Evidence, different research shows that El Salvador is one of the most dangerous places in the world for a woman, to be a woman, right? The female homicide rate is amongst the highest in the world too. And another major part of this violence and why people is coming to this country is because many institutions, despite some important ongoing efforts, are either weak, inefficient, corrupt, or misfunded. Many victims of violence often find no protection from local authorities. So living seems to be the only solution. Of course, there is no magical response to this endemic violence and poverty in El Salvador, neither in the Northern Triangle countries. These difficult problems require a comprehensive and long-term strategy. I'm not implying, I want to finish with this, I'm not implying that there shouldn't be any rules, right? Any migration rules here as in any other country in the world. But we need to have in mind that Salvadorian children and families arriving at this border are human beings facing life-threatening situations. at home and during their journeys, and that they deserve our empathy and should be treated with dignity. And besides, due to the significant role that the U.S. has played in El Salvador over decades, there is at the very least a moral obligation to shelter the ones in danger.
Great, thank you. Milady, Leonor paints a pretty bleak picture. You've been on the ground now in El Salvador for, I think, about a year. What's your impression of what you've seen, and why is the Salvadoran state struggling to come to terms with the crime and violence epidemic that Leonor is describing?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you again for the invitation and for sharing this panel with distinguished panelists. We've worked in the past with Chuck. We went to El Salvador a number of years ago, and Leonor, quite an expert, and really an honor to work with her closely, actually, in El Salvador. It's a complex issue. I think one key thing that comes to mind is impunity and why it's been such a challenge to tackle. The epidemic of violence, you have about 92% of crimes that go unpunished. So that really sends a message that, anything can happen because no one will be punished. So that's definitely an issue that the country is trying to grapple with. You have crimes that were committed pre-war, from the time of the war, crimes committed now, and the issues remain the same. I think there's a light of hope, I would like to think, due to the court ruling of the Supreme Court finding the Amnesty Law unconstitutional, that a lot of these cases will be looked into. There's an effort now by the Attorney General's office. He established a historic crimes unit that's going to look at these cases. And counterpart in the project that we do and the assistance that we provide is to really help the judges that are looking into this case. There's still quite a long way to go, but in terms of looking at the Mozote, a very important case, if we can set the precedence that it doesn't matter when the crime was committed, whether it was in the 80s or it's now, that it's not going to be allowed, I think that sends a strong message. So impunity is definitely a factor, I would say. But it's finding, also I would think that being highly polarized politically, it seems like every 2-3 years is an election period in El Salvador, so it's never the right time. But when is the right time? And to address insecurity, each administration looks at it from a different perspective. Plan El Salvador seguro has a lot of positive aspects of it. I think in terms of the international community and how we're all trying to align our efforts to target key priority areas, key municipalities where crime is quite high, that's a positive aspect. But then there are other measures taken in place that may not be as helpful, right, to solving crime. So everything has to be factored in. There, like Leonor said, there is no magic one, whether it's migration, but crime. But definitely impunity is, it's one of the most disconcerting aspects of moving beyond that.
Great. Chuck, maybe just to stay on the kind of law enforcement side of things for a second. You've had a long relationship with El Salvador. You were there during the war. You were there after the war. You've been there more recently as both a policymaker and a scholar. One of the issues that you've looked at was the creation of the National Civilian Police, the PNC. What is your assessment today of how the PNC has evolved and how much of this this crime and violence problem can be laid, do you think, at the feet of the police?
Thanks. It's an honor to be here with this panel and here at the dialogue, and thanks to Counterpart as well. I think it's hard to, El Salvador is one of these countries which had seen most of a transition from political crime, political violence, to criminal violence and social violence. And so we have and there still is political violence, but it's much reduced, and the scale and the social and criminal violence is much higher, and has some links with political violence, not as much as in Guatemala, I'd say, but it's still important. But I think the story of that transition and the role of the police in the transition, most of the people in this room probably know that the civilian police was a crucial element of the peace accords in 1992. And it was the way that the FMLN, to get the FMLN to agree to a peace accord without incorporating themselves into the armed forces, but to actually have 20% of the new police be ex-guerrillas and 20% be ex-national police members and 60% be people who had not been combatants. And so it was a real success story in terms of integrating former enemies to a large extent, working alongside each other. Now, there were always some recelos and difficulties there, right? But the most important thing in terms of the crime wave about the creation of the national police is that there was a dramatic reduction of the number of people policing the country in the months right after the peace agreement was signed in 1992-93. And so already in 93, you have homicide rates going very high. And by 1994, you already have, ironically, two of the most successful peace processes in the world, South Africa and El Salvador, having the highest homicide rates in the world by 1994. And that's before the gangs really took up the kind of power and influence that they already have. And so part of the story there was just a gap of the transition between the old security forces that were demobilized and the new forces that were created. So that's to set the stage. And then you have a police force that got really high marks in my dissertation, for example, in the mid-1990s, but then experienced increasing problems and corruption and political rivalries and attempts to politicize the PNC became worse in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And so what was an optimism take on that reform effort became relatively mixed, I would say. Most people still consider the PNC to be the most professional police force in the Northern Triangle, but still has a lot of problems. I don't necessarily think the PNC is at the heart of this problem. I think the problem is this sort of system of impunity that exists. And I would just say, one of the words that I think unites the migration challenge with the impunity challenge is fear. We have a lot of people who are fleeing El Salvador because of fear, because of Central America, because of fear of insecurity and violence. Not everyone. There are economic migrants, certainly. I know many of them, illegal and legal in this country, right? But I think you cannot discount the factor of fear that's there. And that fear is what underlines the fear of judges to actually make decisions that will put people in jail, the fear of prosecutors to do their job when they want to do their job, many of them, the fear of police to actually do the arrests that need to be happening, because now we have gangs that are going after the families of Salvadoran police forces in the last few years. And so that's one of the, I think, issues that is confronting the police. And the police is part of that picture, but so is the prosecutor's office and so are the courts. And so are witnesses that are also fearful of coming forward, largely because of gang violence in particular, I would say.
Leonardo, this word impunity has come up a couple times now. I mean, you're a student of impunity. Do you agree with Chuck that fear is kind of at the heart of this? How do we get at the impunity problem in El Salvador?
Well, definitely, the fear is at the heart of many people in El Salvador, including public servants. And this is a part of the legacy of the war and the unsolved truth, reparation, justice issues, right? So still a lot of people is thinking that they will have some kind of that they will have to pay really high if they do their job the way they have to, right? Because there's a really strong sense that going against the law is the better way to be protected, right? And to keep their jobs. So it's the opposite of what it should be. Many judges and prosecutors, they don't want to apply the law, right? So in general, the Amnesty Law decision has made a contribution, a really significant contribution to begin rediscussing impunity issues and the legacy of the past atrocities. So there's been 2 years now since the Amnesty Law was struck down. And we see that the national courts are slowly beginning to be the new actors against impunity, right? 4 different judges in El Salvador, lower courts in small towns, have reopened 4 of the most emblematic and highly sensitive cases. The assassination of Archbishop Romero, the killing of the 6 Jesuits and the 2 women working for them, the massacre of El Calabozo, and of course the massacre of El Mozote, the well-known case of 1,000 people killed by armed forces in 1981. Of these 4 cases, the only one that is making its way through the judicial system is El Mozote, where actually 18 former military members are on trial right now. And the Attorney General Office is also in a very timid way, trying to find their own voice and their own role in these investigations, right? So far, as Milady mentioned, the Attorney General Office created a special unit to investigate historic crimes, which is a remarkable step, right? It's a recognition that they need specialized capacities to deal with these really complex crimes. So far, this unit is a really small team, but it's comprised of very enthusiastic prosecutors. The project that Milady has been talking about is giving a very important technical assistance to them. And there's also an ongoing, for the first time in El Salvador, in 25 years since the end of the war, there's an ongoing dialogue between prosecutors and civil society and victims groups on past issues. And beyond all these legal challenges in terms of criminal accountability, the Amnesty Law has given the opportunity in El Salvador to open new spaces for debating official narratives and for talking in public about the experiences of victims and even the experiences of perpetrators, right? And so this is very important and very, I would say, very challenging in a polarized country, as it is in El Salvador. We don't have to miss this chance of dealing with the past and trying to use all that experience to deal with the present and to prevent a repetition of these atrocities.
Right.
Yeah.
Just to add, I think it's a pivotal moment, I think, in the history of El Salvador and the way that it's dealing with past crimes. And as the Attorney General has said before, he's like, es una deuda pendiente. You know, it's a pending debt that they owe Salvadorians. So I think it's been a remarkable process. It's early on. It's only been 2 years since the court ruling, but to be able to see NGOs, human rights defenders that for so long, 25 years, where they've continued to push forward their own different efforts, different massacres, different cases, but to be able to come together and try to articulate one, not policy, but guidance for the Attorney General to consider now when they're looking at these cases, that's pretty impressive. So about 3 months ago, all the NGOs have gotten together and provided guidelines to the Attorney General because they have a lot of information that the Attorney General doesn't have. Witnesses, locations, just a huge amount of information that, as Leonor said, it's a small team and they're overwhelmed. There's over 150 cases that they're looking at the moment, and there's only 5 prosecutors, which is a lot. So one of the efforts beyond the project, I think we have a duration and we want this to be sustainable, it's actually reaching out to other donors, other embassies that have an interest in transitional justice in this case, in partnering up, right? There's a lot of lessons to be learned from Argentina, Chile, even Colombia, where they can come, and Guatemala actually has some great examples too that can strengthen the work that they're doing on transitional justice. So it's esfuerzos, no?
Yeah. So this is great. You're already jumping in the direction that I had planned for this conversation, which is to try to kind of link the current challenges with what we're seeing in terms of the kind of legacy of the past. So let me ask you about one thing, milady, which is Chuck mentioned the evolution from political violence to kind of social or criminal violence, which I think is commonly what we understand as the nature of the challenge in El Salvador. A lot of especially the gang generated violence that we see today. But there has been kind of a discouraging trend, I would say, towards state-sponsored violence in the form of pretty credible accusations of extrajudicial executions by the police. In some cases, cases that have actually gone to trial, and in a few cases, convictions of police officers. The UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions was in the country earlier this year. She found a pattern, not a policy, but at least a pattern of excessive use of force and executions. What's your perspective on this? How serious is the challenge, and what is El Salvador doing to address it?
Yeah, I think there's a reason why you had 6 different special rapporteurs visit in a span of 5 months last year, including the last one in February by Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings. It's been reported by Factum and Faro, Inside Crime. I mean, so it's nothing new. It's something that we've seen. In terms of our view on working with state institutions, but also with NGOs that have been looking at this issue for a while, is to ensure that the recommendations that are made by the special rapporteurs and the recommendations are fulfilled by the state, meaning we're working closely with state institutions, primarily Ministry of Justice, La Policía, the Attorney General's office, on ensuring that the things that they need to do right, we can get them to that point. So our position is not to validate, but actually be an honest broker in the process, to serve as a bridge, for lack of a better word. But it's an ongoing process, and I think for our advantage, we've had the opportunity to work closely with the police. They don't deny that it's happening, but let's look forward, and this is what needs to be done. So the case you just mentioned, I think 2 weeks ago, 14 military officials were indicted to 14 years in prison for excessive use of force. That's something that we haven't seen before. So the visits, the recommendations, all the noise around it, I think it's having government officials reconsider the way that they view the problem. Because one government official I met with says, there's a pre-Agnes Calamar, there's a pre-special rapporteur visit and a post-special rapporteur visit. So I think they know it is important. Also, it's one of the conditionalities set by Congress for funds to be dispersed. There's 16 conditions, and one of them actually touches on the excessive use of force. So it's been reported by the Human Rights report of the State Department since 2014. So it's been on everyone's radar. So it's actually now addressing and getting them to do and abiding and complying by international human rights standards.
That's great. Chuck, these themes, accountability, impunity, institutions, I mean, these are things I assume are common across the kind of post-conflict environments in which you work. You've studied peace building all over the world. Is there anything that's different about El Salvador? Are there lessons that it should be drawing from other places? And in turn, are there things that El Salvador has confronted that should be that are relevant, for example, for a country like Colombia that's just emerging from an armed conflict situation and trying to implement a peace accord?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain things there where El Salvador is sort of on the far end of the scale, and one of those is the high extent to which violent crime and homicides and extortion in particular reflect gang activity. And that gang activity in El Salvador is especially by gangs that are not necessarily linked to international drug trafficking organizations, as opposed to to Honduras and Guatemala, where you see a more of a link with international drug trafficking organizations. El Salvador, there is some link. Some of it's been discovered and dismantled in past cases. But the importance of the 18th Street Gang and MS-13 is sort of out there on that scale, right? And different. It makes it a little bit different than virtually all the other post-war cases. Having said that, and that's really difficult. I just want to say one of the things you see in El Salvador is governments. I mean, part of what I think we're seeing in the election coming up is both the we have virtually a two-party system since the peace agreement, and that two-party system is now both those parties have shown their inability to actually address both economic challenges and the security challenges and the gang violence. And now after 2 terms of the FMLN, I think there's more acceptance of that. And so they've tried different things. And so they've tried mano dura, they've tried a truce, which did certainly bring down homicide rates dramatically. And that's one of the ways we know that gang violence is actually responsible for a lot of the homicides in the country. And then when this government came into power, the Sanchez-Setting government, they really tried, we're going to shut down these prisons, and we're going to make sure they can't communicate from the prisons, the leaders of the gangs that inhabit the prisons, and we're going to actually get serious about this. And that elicited essentially a war between the police and the gangs that has had these consequences that we've been talking about, the extrajudicial executions as well as assassination of police members and their family members, right? And now there's a little bit of a backing off of that, it seems, but there's nothing that's clearly and unambiguously worked in all of this. All of this time, we have a lot of prevention activity that Milady has been involved in, and lots of others. AID is funding a lot of this, some of which we saw when we were in El Salvador. But really, it's hard to actually get a grip on what it can be successful. So I do want to say that. Having said that, I think but some of the things are generalizable, and in terms of, one of the things that many of us have warned, and a lot of Colombians recognize this, and that is that the peace process, ex-combatants who are mobilized, and become demobilized, they have guns, they know how to make money from guns, they're well organized, and they're used to people being afraid of them, and if they don't have jobs, then it's very easy for them to turn to illicit activities, and especially if they've been involved in those illicit activities for decades, which is the case with the FARC, right? And so the possibilities we're already seeing, which many of us talked about in 2014 and 2015, of common crime and organized crime, having new faces, new forms of organization, revueltos, as we saw, of ex-paramilitaries and ex-guerrillas, organized themselves together. And so all of those things are serious challenges that international actors and civil society actors and political actors must anticipate and respond to, and especially in terms of a presence of the state out in rural and remote areas, where that's actually a crucial challenge in a place like Colombia, I would say.
Leonor, just to continue with this theme of linking past and present, you wrote an article recently called From Forgetfulness to Memory, From Memory to Justice, the case of El Salvador. And there's a really interesting argument in there about accountability for past crimes benefiting the current battle against impunity in El Salvador. Could you kind of explain what you meant by that and lay out the connection that you see between past accountability and the battle against contemporary impunity?
Sure. Well, say that in general, or what the comparative experiences tell us is that dealing today with past atrocities can provide societies and the states first with transferable institutional capacities. So what police and prosecutors can learn from, searching for disappeared people, during the war can be in some way applied to new disappearances, and it's the same with complex crimes as extrajudicial killings in the past, extrajudicial killings here. Second one is that it restores credibility in institutions. So when societies see that institutions are giving an effective response, they will trust better. Third, reaffirms the value of life and dignity of victims of all times, right? Fourth is that it sends a really strong public message that no one is above the law, right? And atrocities will not go unpunished. If the ones that were responsible for killing 1,000 people in the case of El Mozote can be held accountable, who can? Yeah. Right? Five, it breaks cycles of impunity and corruption, right? In some cases, the same actors, or at least the same behaviors, the same patterns from the past, are repeating again, right? Or in present time crimes. We see in the case of Guatemala that military officers have been charged with enforced disappearances, torture, or crimes against humanity, even those with the greatest responsibility for designing the military strategy during the war. But even more importantly is that several of those who have been charged played key roles in the transformation of sectors of the military into hidden powers of today, right? Of people that were responsible for the military strategies during the war were now part of organized crime and large-scale corruptions. And several of them, as we know, were very close to President Jimmy Morales. This is not the case of El Salvador, or at least not yet, right? And I cannot say that is not the case because that's not what happened. I can say that there needs to be more research and more criminal investigations to uncover those links that might or might not exist. But beyond people, I mean, in general, what we see now, what we know now, is that there are similarities in the horror ways that crimes are being committed, right? So criminal groups now are imitating the same or similar methods that were used by militaries or by guerrillas during the war. Second link between past and present is that the state is not effectively protecting victims from crimes in general. And the third link is that the police is still giving heavy-handed responses instead of improving their investigative methods, right? So in El Salvador, since the Amnesty Law was struck down, there's been really strong voices, especially elite voices, that are pushing for not looking at the past and trying to focus on present violence. But I think that there's enough evidence around the world that you can not just forget what happened, that things comes in cycles. So it's important that now El Salvador deals with the past to benefit the current fight against impunity.
So, Milady, I think Leonardo has laid out in a very compelling way the argument for pursuing these cases, and you, I think, mentioned that it was kind of a turning point or a galvanizing moment for the the human rights community in the country. Leonor also mentioned sort of the counter-argument you often hear, which is that this is, it threatens political stability. In El Salvador, very clearly, there are elites on both the right and the left who are threatened by kind of digging up some of these skeletons. I mean, what's your perception of the impact that reopening some of these cases could have, and why I assume you believe it's important to kind of press forward nonetheless, but what would be your response to the argument that this is sort of too risky politically?
Well, I think when is the right time? If it's not now, when is the right time? And I think in terms of the human rights defenders, giving them a space right now to actually work with government institutions on addressing this, it's huge. It's a significant step. Your question is more, are they up to the challenge, or?
Well, are they up to the challenge, and how do you confront not just the kind of technical challenges, right, of building these very complex cases involving things that happened decades ago in which, evidence has disappeared and witnesses' memories are foggy, and, there's a technical challenge in terms of building the cases, but there's also a political context in which the cases are happening, and how do you sort of reckon with those two at the same time?
Yeah, the past and the present, right? Well, look, I think through the various efforts that are happening, whether it's through the project but other government efforts, the time is now to make the investment. I need victims of, whether it's the mozote or someone who lost her son to, excessive use of force. I think from a victim's perspective, the same pain and agony is there, right? And how the government responds to these cases. My take is that it's the right time to do it. I think this government, the 8 months that they have left, to the extent that we're working with them, have shown an openness to address the issue, and that goes a long way. There's sometimes it's really hard to find an alternative dialogue to the mano dura. This is the one approach, but what else could be done? And to do that, the project has been working extensively on building dialogue sessions with vulnerable populations, specifically women and youth that are affected by the gang violence. And that's already more than 50% of the population, women and youth. When you talk about gender-based violence, when all these other issues that have surfaced through the dialogue sessions, how do you get to a point where policymakers are listening to them? It's really either what's happening in La Asamblea and what's happening at the executive level, but there's very little, taking place with NGOs and human rights defenders to come in or just population at large, right, to be able to feed into this dialogue. And through the last 8 months, we've been able to have these dialogue sessions where youth have said, you know what, we're tired of being stigmatized. Not everyone here is a gang member, and because we live in, Canton X doesn't mean that we have anything to deal with. So we've been able to work with the police and building a dialogue, a space for the police to listen to the youth. And as a result of that, they're creating a commission within the police, creating a work plan for the entire country that takes into account youth's input. To inform policymakers and at least the time that's left of the Sanchez Serena administration to really be able to make a dent in security, particularly. It's creating spaces for other methods and approaches to happen rather than this one that you're constantly hearing, right? The mano dura.
Right. So Chuck, there is a very active scholarly debate about the link between transitional justice, whether it's prosecutions, truth commissions, and so on, and whether that is positively correlated with post-conflict rule of law. Harvard professor Catherine Sickink has done a lot of research on this and has found that there is a link between transitional justice mechanisms, ideally a combination of them, and post-transition human rights practices. And other scholars, we've done a bit of a survey of the academic literature. Other scholars have kind of disputed those findings or found that at least it's a little, it's not quite as clear. So I'd be interested in your perspective as an academic on the kind of state of that debate, but also your perspective on El Salvador in particular, and the degree to which you see in the country's current challenges roots in the conflict and the way that especially the way that the transition was handled.
Yeah. So as somebody who lived in El Salvador during the war and saw people that I knew and loved be tortured and killed when I was there in the community that I lived in, I want to see accountability for those things very much, as do most people who live in that country, except for the perpetrators, perhaps. And so I think that there's less evidence than most of us would like to see between transitional justice and its tools and the effects on justice system performance generally, as opposed to human rights performance in a post-war period, right? And so I think it's hard. So in terms of lots of cases out there, there's not that conclusive a finding between the transitional justice and performance in terms of faith in justice systems, generally speaking, and judicial reforms and their success in lots of places. Having said that, I mean, there's a logic that Leonor has laid out of a number of things here. This demonstration effect, you see people who have been put behind bars, and therefore you have more faith in the justice system. A lot of reforms that are institutional reforms and other kinds of reforms that are being taking place in places like Honduras and in Guatemala with the UN-sponsored Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala and the OAS mission against corruption and impunity in Honduras that I've been doing a lot of research on the last year, are based on that kind of demonstration effect, right? If you actually show that high-level cases can work, then you give people more faith in the justice system. Witnesses are more willing to come forward. Prosecutors are more willing to do their jobs and not worry, and judges are more willing to actually to send down the sentences that are appropriate. I think that it's going to be. I actually think that in terms of transitional justice in El Salvador, there's the fear-mongering about instability being fostered by this is way overblown. This is a country that's been talking about differences and political differences very well for 20 years compared to most other post-war countries. It's a country that's been politically working with former enemies pretty well, not just at the political level in the legislative assembly, but also within the police force and with other state institutions, in fact. This is not, and there's a lot of people who are getting older now, right? And there's a lot of younger generation in lots of institutions, including in the military, who want to see changes. And so I think that argument is not there. The argument that's more difficult is this actually going to end impunity and do something about the gang violence problem and the high level of extortion and homicides that create insecurity in the country? And I think that's more of an open question.
And on that point, Leonor, El Salvador's justice system is going through an important transition. We've got a new Attorney General coming in, Supreme Court justices. DPLF has done a lot of work on selection processes for both chief prosecutors and high court judges. They will have this new generation of leaders in the judicial system will have to wrestle with precisely these questions, right? How do you proceed on both the crimes of the past as well as the crimes of the present? How do you balance those things against one another in a world of limited resources and competing priorities? So can you give us some insight into how those processes are working, who the candidates are, and what you expect from the folks who will be in charge of making those decisions?
Yeah, well, this is a critical year, right, for the judicial system in El Salvador and the judicial independence in particular, right? A new Attorney General will have to be selected at the end of this year, and there is an ongoing selection process for 5 new members of the Supreme Court. 4 of them will be appointed to the Constitutional Chamber. Well, first, the new members of the Supreme Court and the new Attorney General should continue, right, the progress that their predecessores made in terms of the fight against corruption and transitional justice, because this progress needs to be sustained in time, and we expect that no setbacks happen, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that in general, the transitional justice processes, or the criminal processes that we're seeing from the past, and the most emblematic cases involving police abuses and the big corruption cases against the ex-presidents, are cases that needs a really strong leadership, right, and specialized and robust knowledge of national and international standards. So this is the kind of people that El Salvador needs, right? Like really strongly in knowledge, in moral, and of course in leadership. All these little the baby steps in terms of corruption and the fight against corruption, impunity, etc., are happening in a context where the other two branches are giving little support, or even trying to not to let the judiciary make any progress, right? So there's not that the kind of collaboration that we would like to see. So in that context, and that context it's really not expected to change dramatically when even if the Arena wins again and FMLN is no longer in the, or if the FMLN continues with the presidency, we don't expect that would change dramatically. So this context needs a very strong and independent judiciary and attorney general office, right, to take seriously their job. I think that that is the key. And how can we get that? Of course, there's not, again, I would like to have the answer to that, but of course, there's not like one method or one formula to get that. But of course, there are some important measures that need to be taken. The first one is the civil society needs to be very aware and needs to participate in every step of these processes with a very propositive way, right? And I think this is been growing in El Salvador. I don't know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, these processes were almost secret. No, but some days somebody knew that, oh, there's a new attorney general, right? So most people didn't really know about that, and certainly civil society groups were not engaged. So that is one thing that needs to happen. The second one is that these processes need to be merit-based, transparent, and to comply with all the international standards. DPLF, with a group of other international human rights organizations, set up an international panel of experts that recently published a report on the current selection process of the new members of the Supreme Court that set up several recommendations and that made an independent evaluations of the 30 candidates that are currently running for the Supreme Court. And I think the third thing is that international community, of course, in the United States and other governments and donors need to support these efforts to have merit transparent processes, but they also need to support the new selected authorities, but it needs to be a support that promotes their own autonomy and independence, and that makes them, to have this leadership that the country needs.
Terrific. So, Milady, this conversation obviously here in Washington, at least, happens in the context of everything we're seeing on the border, and it's sort of the immigration issue is often the prism through which we look at the Northern Triangle. You served at USAID and at the White House in the prior administration, and particularly in 2014 when there was a kind of a similar panic in Washington about, at that time it was unaccompanied children coming over the border and the need to both respond to the crisis at the border, but also think about what, the root causes and why so many people were fleeing. You've now spent time on the ground helping to implement the strategy that you helped put in place. How's it going? And what more could the United States be doing? What would make the strategy more effective in your view? What should we be thinking about as we once again have this conversation about root causes in a place like El Salvador?
Yeah, thanks for a very good question. It's very interesting to work in Washington, drafting policy and actually getting to implement it on the ground. So I actually feel very honored and lucky to be able to see it from both sides, just because it just gives you a whole different perspective, right? You get the numbers, you work with the interagency here, all the different numbers that are reporting, but to see it on the ground, it's just a whole different dimension. I think one of the positive things that were initially proposed in the Central America strategy was the conditionalities that were set by Congress. And I think that's something that we should continue to do. It's not a blank check anymore. You need to deliver. You need to show results. And I think that makes us better governments, a government to do that. And I think the Salvadorian government is listening to that as well. If you look at, since the strategy was implemented till now, there's been some progress. Sure, they're not always linked to migration, but many of them are. In fact, to tackle impunity, weak governance, you have to address the root causes of migration. That's exactly what my project and many in the U.S. government are trying to do. It's not a short-term solution, but it has to happen now, and that's what we're doing. So one, I would highly reinforce and support the conditionalities. I think the visit by the Vice President last week was excellent. I think we need more of that, to be engaged, to be, having this dialogue with the presidents and high-level officials in the region, but also here is key. Having periodic meetings and having a dialogue to reach a solution is key, because this engagement is definitely not the way forward. But yeah, I think those would be two things: continue the engagement and also continue the conditionalities.
Great. And Chuck, maybe just to broaden the question to you, what have you seen work in terms of U.S. engagement in post-conflict countries, and what lessons might be applied from elsewhere to U.S. policy in El Salvador and maybe the Northern Triangle more broadly?
There's it's been, I've done research on police and justice reform principally in the 1990s. And then when I worked at the State Department, I went back and re-engaged with Central America after about a decade of not being very engaged. And I was struck by how we, the U.S. government, are doing a lot of the same things on the security justice institution building side. I think the main difference is that there had been a huge boost on USAID's programming aimed at prevention. But on the sort of our police assistance programs and our judicial assistance programs are still very focused on institutions. And if you just hear, I was just at a meeting at a stabilization symposium last week where an INL person said, a person from the State Department's International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau said, yeah, we basically do institutions. And we've done a whole lot of supply side for 25 years of trying to do technical assistance to improve the technical capabilities of police forces and judicial forces. El Salvador was one of the very first places that we did actually forensics labs in the 1980s, in the middle of the war in 1986, where ICITAP was first created in the Justice Department in order to get some human rights prosecutions that were emblematic, and that didn't work. And we're still talking about, Lorena, I don't know if you noticed, just mentioned the need for investigative capabilities instead of hardline administrative policing. And this is the place where all that started around the world, in the State Departments and in the Justice Department in some ways. And so all of that is a long-winded way of saying that all of this supply-side technical stuff doesn't work very well, is the bottom line, I think. And I think one of the things we need to look at is demand, not supply, demand for justice in these countries. And what can the U.S. government do to foster those who are demanding justice? And that means engaging more with civil society. It means engaging more with those who are trying to push their authorities for outcomes and for accountability, and not just assuming that by providing technical assistance to police that are fearful or corrupt or part of the problem, or the same for judges and the same for prosecutors, that you're going to see any difference in outcomes. The other thing I think that I've been working on is these international hybrid missions of CICIG and MOXIE, which provide technical assistance, certainly, but mainly what they provide is actually a political cover for reformist-minded individuals in the prosecutor's office, especially to do their jobs and prosecute people and know that they can be a little bit less fearful and do their jobs if they want to do their jobs. And that's a new tool that has had mixed results, some good success in Guatemala. I argue in this report that we just put out last week at American University Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. We just put out released a report in Tegucigalpa, where I was on the 21st of June, evaluating the first 2 years of the Honduran OAS mission against corruption and impunity in Honduras, MOXIE, saying that, they've made some pretty good progress in the first couple of years, but they've encountered a lot of problems, and their future is in doubt still. But I think that those kinds of mechanisms can also be helpful. El Salvador, under President Mauricio Funes, considered briefly such a mission, but rejected that. I don't know that it's necessary in El Salvador. Some people think it would be useful. But El Salvador is a place where the two principal political parties have something of a nationalist tradition for some reason. And so there's some political obstacles there that are important in terms of thinking about that. But I think to go back to the main message is, really looking at how to generate and foster those who are looking for demand for justice is really crucial.
Terrific. Okay. Well, we've put a lot of issues on the table. This has been a great discussion. We've got about 20 minutes left, so let's turn to you all and maybe start with these two questions over here. We'll take three at a time and come back to our panelists. I think we have a couple questions back there and then one in the front here. Please introduce yourself, and if your question is directed at a particular panelist, mention that too.
Hi, Sarah Hall Aguila from the Central American Resource Center. I've been going to a lot of events like this, talking about corruption, talking about impunity, and especially focused on the Northern Triangle and root causes of migration. And I heard recently about some violence prevention work that the ambassador of El Salvador was discussing at an event last week, and I wondered how that's connected to. They're doing it in schools, and I'm wondering how that's connected also to the dialogues with the police, and how that also will help decriminalize youth, because I know that that's a big issue too. How that all sort of fits together.
There was one, I think, in the
Hi, my name's Tiffany from Comonics International. We helped implement some of the USAID projects in El Salvador, Guatemala. So I have many questions, but I'll just pick one. So we've been talking about institutions that need institutional support and technical capacity building. We've also talked about the population that needs to come from the bottom up in terms of encouraging, attention to the justice sector and putting people in courts. But I'm also curious about the private sector and what role they can play in all of this, because interestingly enough, El Salvador and Colombia have a lot of relations with each other in terms of going back and forth, exchanging ideas and how they've prosecuted in terms of past history. But the populations are different. In El Salvador, there's a migration, and a lot of people who want to voice their concerns are not there. Whereas in Colombia, they were internally displaced, so they still had a voice. And in this case, they don't. So I'm curious about that and how the private sector can fit into this equation? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's just go one more in front here, and then we'll come back to our panelists.
Good afternoon, and thank you. My name is Luis Parada. I am a Salvadoran American who's very concerned about what's happening in El Salvador after all these years. I was a combatant in the war, and I am really sad to see that all that sacrifice during the war has yet to bring fruition of having a better country. I have a question about what you mentioned about the different changes in authorities that are about to take place. You mentioned the presidency, the Supreme Court, the Attorney General about to change. There's a little things like we know that the justices of the Supreme Court are not up for re-election, so we know that's going to be new people. We don't know yet about whether the Attorney General will put himself for re-election. So I would like you to comment about that. And also when mentioning the two-party system and ARENA and the FMLN, you seem to have left out that this is an interesting new situation in El Salvador where there will be a very strong third-party candidate. So I'd like to see if you can address how that dynamic will work on shaping the attitudes and actually shaping the security of the country and the views towards impunity if that third-party candidate that is promising change, like it's very popular now, wins.
Great. Milady, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll take a crack at the private sector question in particular. I think it's, to talk about human rights in general in El Salvador, for some reason it just has a very bad connotation, depends who you ask. Many would say, oh, you work on human rights, you must be from the left, or if you work on human rights, you're defending gangs, or it's just a very interesting perspective who you ask. As a project, we're fairly recent and we're having more contact with the private sector and how they grapple with the different security issues. They work in communities where they need to attract a good labor force, but how do you do that when the communities are divided? And internally, what kind of policies do you have that encourage diversity, inclusion? So we've begun a process to reach out to the private sector to see how we can best have a change in paradigm. It really takes a lot of work to work with someone that obviously has a business and that at the same time they want to be inclusive, but internally they face their own challenges. We've heard of one case in particular where the company is very inclusive. They actually reach out, but they allow LGBTI, people with disabilities, all open. Well, internally, it was hard for someone to work next that was a transsexual, but on the other side of the office, they had someone who murdered their son, but it's okay for them to work next to someone who murdered their son, but they're not in favor of working with a transsexual person. So the company decided to cancel altogether, their effort to work with LGBTI community. So it's not just the private sector that, even when they try to do their job, but culturally, they face challenges within the business. So it's finding the right balance. It's learning more. I think as a project, it's not to come in with all the solutions, but seeking what works best for the private sector. So yes, there are challenges, but they're part of the stakeholders, part of the equation of, making a difference in everyday, in the life of Salvadorians. So it's not just looking at the private sector, not private sector, but the executive or government institutions, but how do you bring them in? Because it is a new space. So there is no solution right away, but definitely having this dialogue space has helped us understand the problem more.
Great.
So that's on the...
Yeah, just a comment on the private sector issue. Well, in El Salvador, I think the private sector is an actor on different levels and in different ways. And I think that there are many ongoing small initiatives on the community level based the ones that are being supported by the U.S. Embassy in El Salvador, but there are several supported by different donors. And at this community level, the private sector plays a key role engaging in trying to be part of the solution of the crime issues, and in particular, given opportunities for ex-gang members and things like that. So it is important to not to forget that the private sector is part of the equation. I think it's more challenging to think in the private sector in the national level, right? In the national level, the private sector is actually a political actor. And it's always been linked to one of the main political parties, right? So there are conversations and dialogues with the private sectors for different issues. For example, the tax reform and some others. So at that level, I don't think it's that easy to work with the private sectors, like engaging them in the human rights agenda. Right, but at the community level, there are more opportunities. And the current Attorney General has given some signs that he would be interested in running for a second term. He can do it. I think the most important thing is that any high-level authority should be re-elected in an automatic way. If a high-level authority, as an attorney general or a Supreme Court member or any other high authority wants to run for a second term, they need to go through the whole process. That's what the international standards says, right? So it needs to be evaluated, and it needs to go through the whole process as with the rest of the candidates. That's what should happen. I know this is not something that has happened in the past in El Salvador, but that's the right way to do things, right? And in general, the Attorney General process in El Salvador lacks of rules. It's a very open process where deadlines and profile and specific rule for the process are not really clear. So anything can happen, right? So it's important to monitor that selection process.
I'm just going to say a couple of, one is, in Honduras, they actually created a pretty rigorous set of rules for the process for creating the Attorney General. And they had candidates, and they had civil society participation, a whole process, the 5 final candidates. And so maybe you haven't heard, but on Friday they just tossed that all out the window and asked the guy who hadn't ever applied to be in it, because by his own admission, he's like, I'm not sure I'd make it through the process because I'm not very good at public speaking and things. He's just got re-upped. And so they completely threw that whole process out the window, a legal process out the window. And a lot of people think that's not such a bad thing because the people who were up for it would probably not have demonstrated the kind of independence that this Attorney General has shown. I don't know what that says, but it's maybe it just says something about Honduras. But I do want to just echo what you've just said in light of that. I think I'm just going to echo what Leonor just said about the private sector. I was meeting on Monday. I was in Guatemala City meeting with private sector representatives. And the private sector in El Salvador gets and supports in a whole different way the need for doing something about gang violence. Not about accountability for the past, but doing something about gang violence. And it's really remarkable, and it is an asset that should be harnessed and utilized. And so, because Milady and I, 4 years ago, met with people, business leaders who were trying their best and of their own initiative dealing with ex-gang members, as Leonor mentioned that. I think it's worth citing that because it's actually highly unusual in Latin America, I would say, certainly in Central America. Capitan, I'm just going to say in response to your question, I think certainly if Bukele who's leading in all the polls is able to run, and is able to win, then that actually opens up, I think, some opportunities for changing things, particularly as regarding transitional justice. And I think that some of the, sacred cows might not be so sacred under that kind of administration. It's just speculative, but just based on how that is. But we've seen two-party systems get ripped apart and blown apart in the last decade in Colombia and in Honduras and in Costa Rica and Mexico, and so it does open up possibilities, and I think you're right to say that we shouldn't make assumptions about continuity necessarily in light of that. So.
Great. Let's take another quick round, and we'll come back to our panelists. Yeah, start in front here.
It's a testament to the quality of the panelists that in this very hot, in the middle of a heat wave, in the middle of a World Cup, you were able to get a full.
I think it's a testament to the audience. That's what I was thinking.
Well, I want to thank the panel. I'm Alexander Kravitz. I'm a former Salvadoran diplomat. Luis asked my question, but I want to follow up on it. But first, a question for Leonor. You talked about the migrants rather, deserving empathy and to be treated with dignity. I fully agree with you, but I couldn't help thinking, that here you're almost preaching to the converted, and that's probably falling on deaf ears in terms of the current administration. So I wonder, I don't know if you have it, but I wonder if you have any numbers in terms of asylum requests, and how many of those asylum requests have been granted as a result of violence or fear of violence, fear of fear of the maras. That's the first question. And the second one, to follow up on Luis's question and putting all three of you on the spot. Let's say that we're meeting. Things change. Individuals matter, right? The Corte Constitucional and the current Attorney General make a difference. A lot of new actors, are coming. If we are here on the 2nd of July of 2019, this is pure speculation, but still, given your knowledge, would you care to speculate in terms of fighting corruption and impunity? You think you would tell us that things are better, same, or worse in El Salvador? Thank you.
My name's Dan Clune.
Wait for the microphone. Thanks.
My name's Dan Clune. I'm an attorney working with Catholic Charities representing immigrants, including some clients from El Salvador who are seeking asylum based on persecution of their families by the gangs. And one of the issues that comes up in asylum proceedings is whether the government is unwilling or unable to protect the victims of the persecution. This was an issue that was highlighted by Attorney General Sessions in a recent opinion. So you all touched on the question of impunity, but I'd be interested in your opinion about whether, in your view, the government is unwilling or unable to protect victims of persecution by the gangs.
Anyone else? All right, let's take those two. Maybe we'll go in reverse order this time. Chuck, you want to start?
I'm going to largely punt on your question. I just don't have a good enough sense to speculate. I think it's going to be tough. I think these issues of corruption and impunity for past violations of human rights and impunity in terms of accountability for current organized gang violence and crime are three little pools that intersect a little bit, and it's not clear. It's not clear, and each of them have their own little dynamic. And so I think it's going to be very tough to do something about organized crime. It'll be very interesting to see, especially in light of the new, revelations about the Bukele, and the election, the prior election, and paying some gangs and things like that. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. But I don't have much to say on that, and I'll also defer to others on the other question.
I don't know what's going to happen in El Salvador, but I would like to say that it should be better, right? It should be better, and that we want to see more of the progress that the Attorney General Office and the Supreme Court has been doing on this really wide agenda on impunity and transitional justice. I think that part of our mission in general, I mean, civil society groups, donors, international organizations is to accompany these new officers. I mean, the new magistrates of the Supreme Court, the new Attorney General, or the same Attorney General if he's reelected, just to shape their agenda, to try to make them very clear what is important in El Salvador, and to give them proposals, right, to help them to go their way. And the current Attorney General, he was not an expert on transitional justice or anything, but he at some point opened the door to discuss the past atrocities, and he welcomed, right, ideas. How do I deal with these cases? I've never done it. Nobody in El Salvador has ever done this. So let's discuss. Let's talk with the ones that have been pushing this agenda for so many years, right? The civil society groups, other experts from Latin America, and we've following that path, right? So I think that we need to continue doing that. On your first question, I'm not an expert on migrations. I'm not a lawyer on migration, so I don't have the numbers. I know that WOLA and other organizations that have a specific program for that have been showing some numbers on asylum. I know that there are not that many, but there are some cases when courts have granted asylum on those grants, that proving that in El Salvador there's fear for some people. I don't know if we can say that in general El Salvador is not willing or able to protect victims. I think there is a context that is not in favor of that. But it's important to review, I would say, case by case. But it's true that many victims don't find the proper answers. Some of them they do, and some of them don't.
Lady.
I would just add, in terms of corruption and impunity, I mean, I'd like to leave on a positive note and think they are in a better place. They may not have MASI, they may not have CSIG, but I think what this Attorney General has been able to do, for the most part, there's been other cases where I personally think, could have done better, but that's not up to me. But in terms of corruption and impunity, it's definitely something that he's taken on very seriously. Without having these bodies, that we think they should have. So in absence of that, I think it's a very positive sign. And also the work of civil society too, and getting the governments to react to corruption and impunity is something that hadn't been seen in I would say even the last 5 years. Mm-hmm. I remember I've been working in El Salvador for a while, but I've been living there for the last year, and Leonor early on said, because I would get like, why aren't we doing, how can we get them to do more? Or she's like, this hasn't happened in a very long time, of getting civil society to react to impunity cases and being involved. So, yes, we wish things would happen a lot faster, but when there's been a gap and an absence for so long, it's very difficult. So yes, to your question, I think we are better off. The country is better off. And I am not a migration lawyer either. A lot of the issues that we look into as a project are addressing the root causes of migration. And sure, probably a lot more could be done. I mean, you see reports of massive internal displacement, and what's happening. I think the government has gradually gone. They're not calling it displacement. I think there's another term that they're using, but they're getting closer to acknowledging that there is internal displacement, which causes migration too. So it's been gradual. It's probably not where we want them to be, but it is being acknowledged in a different way. So.
Terrific. Well, I've learned a lot from this conversation. I hope all of you have. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Chuck, for wearing a tie in spite of the heat. I want to thank my colleagues Tamar and Anna and Irene for their support and counterpart again for co-sponsoring this event with us. Really enjoyed having you all here. Please join me in thanking our stellar panelists.